Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I'm based in private practice in Harley Street, London. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Anne Scoular. Anne founded and ran for many years one of the leading organizations in the country that offers training for executive coaching. But we're actually talking to her for a very different reason. She is an expert on a particular member of the royal family, and we're going to talk to her a bit about that. Now, it may seem at first that our conversation seems a bit historical, but I think it's really kind of opposite at the moment because the royal family is so much in the news. There's Meghan and Harry and their documentary. There's the Crown, the recent death of the Queen. And I think that I've read her thesis, which is on a member of perhaps one of the most famous members of the royal family, and she'll tell us a bit about that in a minute. I know I'm remaining enigmatic a little bit as to who that is, but I think it tells us a lot, also the story about the nature of celebrity and how lonely it can be for people who appear to have everything, actually, in the end. And I know as a consultant psychiatrist who sees many celebrities in private practice, that is the case. So, Anne, welcome to the show. And tell us a little bit about the member of the royal family that we're going to discuss, but also tell us about, first of all, how you got interested in this member of the royal family and your connection with the subject, how you got drawn into the subject. Tell us a bit about that.
Thank you. So it's Queen Victoria, and I started life as a historian. My first degree was in history a very long time ago. And I've had a long career doing all sorts of other things, diplomat, banker. And as you said, I founded Mailer Campbell 23 years ago. And I'm just stepping back from that. And I'm going back to my first love of history. But while I was running Mailer Campbell, obviously, we trained very senior leaders from around the world to coach, which I could summarize as saying, teaching them to shut up and listen. Which makes a profound difference, of course. In fact, the people who come to us are the ones who don't need it. But while I was there, of course, I was extremely interested in global female leaders. It occurred to me that Queen Victoria was the first global female leader. And nobody had really studied her from the work, the business, you might say, side. There's been a lot about her and her dresses and her relationships with her children and so on. But looking at her as a person with a global role who had a massive day job hadn't been done before. And so I was very interested in that. I did a master's thesis in it in my spare time.
And I think this is particularly interesting because of the sorry, something went wrong with the sound there, but can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
I think this is particularly interesting because of the notion of we live in a patriarchal society, maybe less so, but Queen Victoria at the Victorian age was in a very patriarchal society. So I'm very interested in the challenges she faced because I think they replicate the challenges that female leaders today face, because there's a male-female dynamic, which I think becomes very relevant when men have a woman who's a boss, for example. And I still think that hasn't gone away as an issue. What are your thoughts about that?
That's why I got specifically interested in Queen Victoria. When Hillary Clinton was running for president of the United States, I'd always thought, up until then, I'd always thought of myself as sort of post-feminist. These hugely brave women who were physically courageous, prepared to chain themselves to railings to die for the sake of equality, had been very brave, 4 generations ago. And as a result, I was able to do what I liked. Nobody ever got in my way. And then when Hillary Clinton emerged, i.e. the possibility of a woman becoming president of the United States, and there was a horrific backlash against that, not just as personified by Trump, but the thought, had we been told 5 years earlier that a fellow candidate for president of the United States who actually won would incite crowds saying to shout, lock her up. Anyway, I got very interested and I thought, it hasn't gone away.
And one aspect of Hillary Clinton's femininity, as it were, that became used a lot by the media was a notion that she was medically vulnerable. There was a couple of episodes where there were health scares and the media made a big play of that. Although they didn't directly connect the two, there was this notion that women are not as hardy as men. And that still kind of lingers a bit as an issue, I think.
Mm. I see it almost the reverse, that women have to do more and be stronger. You know, that old wonderful phrase, true equality will be achieved when mediocre women make it to the top. Or Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, backwards and in high heels. It's still true.
Right. So, what another thing that interests me is the notion of the Victorian era as embodying the stiff upper lip, right? And yet Victoria, we're going to find out, did not seem to be having a stiff upper lip when her beloved Albert died. And yet, if we contrast that with what happened with Elizabeth and when Prince Philip died, it seems as if actually we live in an era of a more strong kind of stiff upper lip thing going on in terms of the royal family than the Victorian age. Because in fact, she was so non-stiff upper lip, according to what I read that you said, the monarchy might have been in danger. Could you say a bit about that, the stiff upper lip?
I think the causes of that, which I'd love to talk about, because I think that's very useful for people today, the causes for her crisis, 10 years of appalling grief in the 1860s after Albert died, were somewhat contextual, but it interacted with personality. I think Queen Victoria and the late Queen Elizabeth did have some things in common. And the biggest thing they had in common, which I think when both of them died, society responded to in the same way for the same reason, is lack of testosterone and therefore lack of male ego getting in their way. And both of them were exceptional listeners, quite exceptional, and asked questions. So Queen Victoria, one of the bases of her power, I talk sometimes about the different aspects of her power, the French and Raven stuff, which I think can be very usefully applied to Queen Victoria to understand how she ended up in the extraordinary position she was of the world's obviously greatest female leader ever. And part of the reason for her power is she really listened. Interference didn't get in the way of all the stuff. She absolutely listened. She listened to what people were saying, to what they were not saying. She acutely observed body language. She actually had a remarkable ability, which I think was trained rather than genetic, that she could be at a dinner party, which she was pretty much every night. There were crowds, 10, 12 people around the dinner table most nights. And she could listen to individual conversations right around the table. She had very acute hearing, but she could also differentiate. Most of us can't do that. I think it was a result of her early training. There was a lot of her early training which stood her in good stead, not from her mother, from Baroness Leighton.
Let's just talk a little bit before we get into the details of the story about the fact that she was this great female leader of the world. This was an empire on which the sun famously never set, and she was the head of this empire. By the time our late Queen Elizabeth came along, the empire was dwindling, and during her reign, it kind of disappeared, basically. I mean, there was still the Commonwealth. But Queen Victoria was at the pinnacle of the greatest empire in terms of geographical reach the world has ever seen. Could you say a bit about that?
Of course, it was the largest in extent. And when I grew up, I had a map on the wall with the bits of the empire coloured pink, and there were a lot of them. But it's also very interesting. I'm a historian, and I think the British Empire was qualitative, apart from quantity, it was also qualitatively different from those that had gone before. Not because the British are more fine and upstanding people, although they thought that at the time, and I'd like to think it, but simply because of an accident of history. It was far more liberal than the Spanish seaborne empire or the Portuguese seaborne empire or the Dutch empires, which had gone before, and of course far more than the Roman, simply because it was a creature of the 19th century and very affected by the great waves of evangelism and equality and anti-slavery. This was the generation that fought passionately against slavery and the abolition of it. It had started earlier. It started in the 1780s, but the baton was picked up, handed from one very brave and courageous person to another, black and white. And it was, of course, fundamentally built on inequality and exploitation. And so it was unacceptable in today's terms. But comparatively, it was also a source of some good.
Okay, but I find it interesting that you should say that it was the more liberal of the empires, because today the reputation is that it was quite cruel and regressive.
It was.
And racist,
just others were
things
more
like
cruel.
That. Okay.
But the problem with discussion today is that history is not taught the way I would like to see it taught. In schools, people have bite-sized chunks. There seems to be an awful lot of Henry VIII and an awful lot of Hitler. And I don't have children myself, but I'm very interested in this. And I keep talking to the young people that I come across, and it seems not to have changed. They don't have a sense of the development of constitutional law, Magna Carta, the fact that the barons stood up to King John in 1215 and 16 and 21, and that there has been a stroppiness on this island for a very long time. Many ills, many evils, but some interesting themes as well.
So you're describing the Victorians as liberal, which is fascinating, because I don't think of them as liberal. I don't think most people think of them as liberal.
Well, some were, some weren't, of course. I'm only contrasting them with previous empires in the 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, and 1500s, which were less so, simply because they were a product of their time as much as the Brits were a product of the 19th century. So I'm not ascribing any great credit to anybody. It's just a historical fact.
So,
and as an example, in the difference between Australia and New Zealand. Australia colonized, settled, overrun, attacked, exploited, whatever phrase you want, in the 1700s, hence the abysmal treatment of the Aboriginal people. New Zealand, several generations later, the Treaty of Waitangi, 1840, by which time the evangelical movement and the anti-slavery and many different the rise of Methodism, many different tides in history caused there to be just a fundamentally different mindset. I mean, the Treaty of Waitangi was meant to be, in fact, it wasn't, of course, but it was meant to be a contract between equally contracting parties. It's very different from 1740, but very imperfect.
So let's talk about Queen Victoria before the death of Albert, because that leads up to what happens after the death of Albert. Tell us a bit about herself, her reign, her childhood, her life before the death of Albert, and her relationship with Albert.
Yeah. So Queen Victoria, I sometimes say, was born twice. The first time in 1819, and she came to the throne in 1837, age only 18 years, 3 weeks, and a couple of days. But the age of menarche was much later then, so functionally you could compare her much more with something like a 16-year-old girl today. So think of a 16-year-old girl, better educated than most girls at the time, much worse educated than all educated men, but highly conscientious, keen, huge physical energy. She had great stamina, great physical energy, and she had had a very oppressive childhood. Her father died when she was 8 months old. Her father was very bright. Her father, fascinatingly, the Duke of Kent, was very interested in socialism. So had he lived, we might have had the first socialist king, which would have been interesting. However, he didn't. But her mother was an airhead. And her mother was, for whatever reason, and her own background is obscured by the loss of a lot of documentation in the Napoleonic Wars. But her mother had a very bad habit of attaching herself to inappropriate men. And during Victoria's childhood, she'd attached herself to Sir John Conroy. He had her in what we'd now call coercive control. I think that's pretty clear. And they looked on Victoria, the heir to the throne, as the only card that they had to play. And they played it in a very strange way. They kept her away from the court. They locked her up. They stopped her from seeing anybody else. They tried to control access to her totally, which of course had the paradoxical effect of making her very strong and very resilient and very determined not to be controlled by her mother and Sir John Conroy. She loathed Conroy. So she'd had this very strange childhood, completely lonely. She was totally forbidden any childhood friends. Really fundamental in terms of her later life. Conroy wanted her to play with his two daughters. She, of course, loathed them. Her childhood diaries are available and they are unedited. There's a transcript which escaped the editing scissors. And it's very correct and proper because her governess and her mother read her diary. But it is crisp and cool talking about the two Conroy girls. The only love she had in her childhood was her dog, Dash. And she poured her love into this Cocker Spaniel. And later on, she had crushes on opera singers and things. She thought Madame Grisi was wonderful. Anyway, very lonely childhood. So from this, suddenly, she's got, at 18, but more or less 16, and a very sheltered upbringing, she's suddenly got the keys to the kingdom, literally. She's voted an income of £385,000 a year, which is a fortune in 1837. Of course, it was to cover her staff costs and running of Buckingham Palace and et cetera, et cetera. But still, suddenly she's got the world at her feet. She's young. She's quite sweetly pretty in her early years. People are astonished that suddenly this young person is the head of the whole patriarchal system. There was no question that it be questioned, which is very interesting. The rule of law. She was legally the monarch, and it was, even though in such a patriarchal society it was accepted. Like, I was in Korea. I lived in Korea before it opened up. An extremely sexist patriarchal society at the time, and I was heading up a bank office. But I never experienced patriarchy or oppression, because the deep, deep tradition of courtesy in Korean society was so strong that it was more powerful than, what do you mean we've got to deal with a female? And I think the same with Victoria. Anyway, she was queen and she had an absolute blast her first 2.5 years. She adored the first 2.5 years. She wrote in her diary, I love this work. She worked extremely hard. She exercised hard. She partied hard. She could have balls in Buckingham Palace, and they'd go out on the balcony at 4 or 5 in the morning and watch the sunrise over St. Paul's, and then she'd be back at her desk 3 hours later. She was 18. So she had this flip from quiet to extraordinarily the best time of her life, working hard, feeling she was achieving things, playing hard, having fun. She hadn't had fun for her first 18 years. And then in 1840, she marries Albert. She wrote beforehand, I don't want to get married because I actually have a temper. I'm accustomed to getting my own way, and I don't want to lose that. She knew what Victorian society was like. She sadly was let down by a sort of a coup de foudre. She saw Albert for the second time. He'd been sort of polished up in the meantime. She had met him once before, but not like this. And she stood at the top of the stairs, and there he was at the bottom of the stairs, having just come off the boat, ravishingly beautiful. And she completely fell for him. And she asked him to marry her within 4 days. It was her prerogative, not him. She outranked him. And her diary survives unedited until 6 days after their wedding. From that volume escaped the editing that came later. And we know she adored sex. So you're right, not your conventional Victorian. She had an absolutely phenomenal early few weeks of her marriage. Then within 3 weeks, she discovered she was pregnant. She was furious. And then in her first 10 years of her marriage, she had 7 children. So she was pregnant or recovering for almost all the first 10 years of her reign. She had 9 children altogether with Albert. She and Albert put together an extraordinarily impressive body of work. He was remarkable. She was a very interesting woman, and they were right across society. They were constitutionally very proper, very correct. So they supported the government as they were required to do, and far more so. They travelled all around the country. They supported everything from engineering to arts to theatre, music, painting. The early founders of the National Gallery, every aspect of society, they would do their best to lift it up, to help. She made a huge change in the monarchy's involvement in charity. She was far more generous than anybody had been before, and she set up a sort of an institutional expectation, which survives today, that the monarchy will make an enormous contribution to those who are less fortunate in life. And she thought, and the culmination of all this was that perhaps out for Albert was the 1851 Great Exhibition, which was his idea. He managed it. He was a brilliant manager, and it was completed on time, under budget, and delivered. It was a great project. They could do huge projects in those days. I'm not quite sure what's happened to us. And she was expecting a long life, fine. And then suddenly, age 42, he died. Very, very suddenly, of typhoid, the drains at Windsor. Yes, she maybe should have seen it coming a bit. He had been hideously overworking. He did not look pretty by the time he died. He was fat and puffy and clearly stressed and drained and tired. But the doctors who had colluded with Albert's emotional abuse of her, which I'm sure you want to talk about, were too scared to tell her the truth. And the doctor said to her at 11 o'clock in the morning of the 14th of December, he'll be fine, he'll get through this. And he died at 11 o'clock that night. And she was thunderstruck.
So you mentioned physical abuse, emotional abuse.
Emotional abuse.
Yeah, tell us a bit about that.
So her childhood, Sir John Conroy, she loathed Sir John Conroy with such a passion that it does make one ask questions. Certainly Jane Ridley, who was my supervisor for my thesis, I was very privileged, the greatest living British biographer and historian, in my view. And Jane Ridley has gone on record to say that the child was unquestionably a victim of emotional abuse. The language in Conroy's diaries is foul. His treatment was abusive of both the mother and the daughter. To give one example, she had what might have been typhoid, they're not quite sure, when she was 16 in Ramsgate when they were there on holiday. Again, probably the drains. And she was coming up to age 18. Now, age 18, she would have not required a regency. So age 18 is the age of majority for succeeding to the throne. And they're only 18 months away from that. So the mother and Conroy were panicking because they were desperate to get her to sign a document saying that she was not mentally fit, and she would, even after she came of age, she would give them the regency. They wanted the power, they wanted the money. And Conroy came into her room, which is very, very unusual for a Victorian man with a young girl. Baroness Lazon, the rock without whom Victoria would not have got through her first 18 years, came with him. He screamed at her and screamed, ordering her to leave the room, and she refused. But Conroy came in and stood over Victoria when she was ill, very, very ill with typhoid. Her hair fell out. She lost 2 stone as a child. She was very, very ill, and threatened her to sign this form. And she had the courage and the strength not to sign. It was just one event. It was horrible. Then totally different. When she was married, the patriarchal society. You've got a woman who's 4 feet 11 tall, and she's the head of the army, she's the head of the church, she's the head of the government. And nobody tried to depose her in favor of a man, but there was all sorts of passive aggressive undermining and conspiring and seeking of power. Albert took her power. Jane Ridley believes that he kept her pregnant in order to do that. So he got keys to red boxes. It was named that if she died in childbirth, which was statistically quite a high chance in those days, he would be regent, sole regent, nobody else. Then he started seeing ministers, and then he started seeing ministers on his own, etc., 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 etc. But what he also said to her, which was gaslighting, was she did have this furious temper. Well, he's nicking her job, and they would have blazing rows, and he wrote her notes afterwards, and he addressed her, "Dear child," good start, but he accused her of, he said, "You're very close to being mentally ill," and the doctors also said, if you don't calm down, if you don't, stop trying to do this queen business, just go home, dear, and just, do some knitting with your children. Not exactly, I overstate, but the doctors did express concern about her going mad. So from all sides, she was hearing from her beloved husband and from her trusted doctors, she was hearing that she was potentially going mad. They always repeated George III, and there's debate as to what his illness actually was, but they didn't know that it wasn't genetic. So instead of just being seen as a woman who's absolutely furious that she's being kept from her birthright, she was told she was going mad.
She was angry,
yeah,
that she was being kept from her birthright, but did she do anything about it other than shout and scream?
Great question. Yes, and the most important thing she did was she kept her dignity, and she took precedence on all occasions, and she held herself, even though she was 4 feet 11, she held herself with such extraordinary dignity and presence that people constantly write about it. It's often the first thing they write about when they've met her in their diaries. She argued back, and Albert wasn't evil at all. He was the greatest king we've never had. He was an extremely sensitive, intelligent, highly educated man, and he took on this role because he wanted to bring about a liberal Europe. So Albert was one of the wellsprings of liberalism in England and attempting to be in Germany. He wanted to see Germany unified under a liberal regime. Of course, it did end up unified under the least liberal regime, namely the Prussian state, which led to the First and Second World Wars. And Victoria fought against that. I can give you some examples, but it was after Albert died.
Okay, but I thought she was the boss. I'm slightly surprised that Albert was able to manipulate her or manipulate the system. It seems to me that she, from what you're telling me, I'm just now rolling the dice as a psychiatrist, that she the attachment she had to him got in the way a little bit of her ability to be assertive with him, I think.
That's precisely so. But also, I mean, this is one of the 5 things, if we get to that, on why I think her crash, her grief after Albert died was so extreme. And the 5th, but let's talk about it now, is identity. And she was in an impossible position in terms of her identity. So on the one hand, she was indeed the boss. Constitutionally, she was head of everything. And things that mattered far more then than now, like the church. Deeply significant that she was the head of the church in England and Scotland, as well as the army and the government, and etc., 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 etc. But the 1860s in particular were the high point of an extreme reaction, in a way, to the Industrial Revolution, to the horrors of the Industrial Revolution, which were present for almost everybody. Everybody could see how frightening and how polluting and dangerous the early Industrial Revolution was. And as a sort of a compensation, there was an intensified sense that a woman's place was in the home. And particularly in the 1860s, there was this move that a woman should be, quote, the angel in the house. Now, you know what angels do? They don't fight back. They're quite insubstantial. And remember, Victoria's conscientious. She's a good girl. She wants to do a good job. So she's signed up to marriage. She regards it as a profound, lifelong spiritual vow. And she's also signed up to be queen, which she also regards as a lifelong spiritual vow. And they are directly in contradiction. As queen, as head of state, she should be out there. As wife, to be a good wife and a good mother, she should be silent at home. It's irreconcilable.
The very interesting picture I'm getting from you is that these were two quite competent people managerially and so on, and as executives, corporate executives, let's put it that way. Yes. So how do I put this as delicately as I can? The modern view of royals, I think all over the world and closer to home, is that they're decorative and there are people who provide a key role in pomp and circumstance at state occasions. But the notion that they are running Goldman Sachs in a competent way, let's put it that way, is not around. And yet these people, as you described them, were competent and running stuff. They could have taken the easy route of just riding horses and going shooting and having lovely dinner parties. But they seem to want to actually help run the country. What was going on there?
Not so much run the country, because they were not at all run the country. They were very, very clear, both of them, on their constitutional role. Albert less than Victoria. Albert had a more German view. After he died, Disraeli said, had Albert lived, we would have enjoyed the blessing of autocratic government. Disraeli's full of good lines. But no, they wanted to make a difference. So they're very 21st century. So reforms in the army. There was not an army medical hospital. So, if the army goes away to fight, lots get injured. Albert and Victoria, because they started before Albert died, but she continued afterwards, campaigned, and Netley Hospital in Hampshire was built as a direct result of their initiative. That shouldn't there be a specialist military hospital? The 1851 exhibition, painting, the National Gallery being started, which they encouraged, but not just in London, all around the country, all sorts of things. They would lend their name to, they gave money to support things. They were very active. But this idea that the royal family has a symbolic role rather than an administrative one started in the Victorian era, because her power declined, her formal power declined during her reign very considerably. The major Reform Acts in the 1830s, and then particularly the 1867 Reform Act and the subsequent ones, meant that it was the beginning of democracy. Well, half democracy, men voting. And suddenly, in the 1830s, and just after Victoria came to power, cabinets were still formed by chaps having a chat. It was done internally within the cabinet. And with the Reform Acts, they had to look outwards. Parliament was actually representing more people. It had always represented some people, but it was representing more. So she lost a great deal of her power in formal terms, but she gained informal power. The huge involvement in charity and the arts and so on. So actually, Bagehot, the constitutional journalist, he's always quoted as an authority on the Constitution. He's no such thing. He was a journalist. But he wrote about the difference between the efficient and the decorative, and said that monarchy had both sides, but the efficient shrank, and it became largely symbolic.
So you've got this very competent, resilient woman. Albert dies, albeit unexpectedly, and she was very attached to him. And then she, if I can put it this way, crashes and burns. So tell us a bit about that. Tell us what happened.
She completely crashes and burns. So People knew how attached she had been to him, and they were terrified of anything happening to him. They knew that her attachment to him was quite disproportionate. And it happened. She almost completely fell apart. She wrote in her diary, I mean, when I was writing my thesis, it was so difficult not to put quote after quote. She was a stunning writer. If her diaries hadn't been edited, she would have been the Pepys of the 19th century. She was a fabulous writer. She had such a turn of phrase, and she told it like it was. Honest, in terms of strengths inventories, her top two strengths, I think, were physical resilience and honesty. And she could write well and told it straight. So her diaries were brilliant. So she writes about the agony of her of her loss from Albert. Now, of course, your husband has died. You're only 42. You're left with 9 children and an empire and country to run. But her loss was disproportionate. Her personal agony was extreme. She wrote about suffering wave after wave of screaming pain, of loss. She would stand at Osborne in the middle of February on the Isle of Wight and look out at the cold grey sea and wish she was under those waves. She constantly longed for death herself. She withdrew. She pulled herself right back like a wounded animal. She hid in Osborne or Balmoral or anywhere, which made it very difficult for the politicians. But her personal grief, it wasn't just her, it affected the monarchy. So in the 1860s, yes, a widow should mourn, should not be visible for 2 years. Yes, they gave her that. But when, after that time, 1863, 1864, they realized that we're not going to have all these parties and balls and things that we used to have, the tradespeople are not making as much money as they were making, and lots of mayors around towns, wives are giving them grief for, how come we don't get to go to Buckingham Palace anymore? Anyway, the chorus of frustration and opposition started to come up. Somebody hung a sign outside Buckingham Palace saying, "To let, owing to previous owner going out of business." Sir Charles Dilke made a famous rabble-rousing speech. A member of Parliament made a speech in Newcastle advocating the abolition of the monarchy and the formation of a republic. France had become a republic in 1870. And there were Republican clubs all over Britain. It got so bad that her children wrote her a letter, and which began, "Your Majesty," but continued. I mean, I summarize, "Mother, you are endangering our legacy. Get a grip, get out there." So she had to be seen, and she didn't. And she withdrew totally, the widow of Windsor, for 10 years. And the extraordinary thing about it is then she did recover. She went to a place so dark that a lot of people don't come back. And she came back. So almost she was born again, born for a second time. And she lived actually 40 years, almost 39 years after Albert died. And in this later part is when you see her fully blossoming, which is the piece we never hear about Queen Victoria. Little fat woman on statue. But she was extraordinary in those last 39 years. But the first 10 of them were lost to grief.
So let's talk about this, because I think this is very interesting as a psychiatrist, because modern therapy and psychiatry says that people like her need treatment.
Yes.
She didn't seem to get any treatment,
exactly.
treatment, and then she recovered. So the notion that there may be a natural recovery rate, or that people can get themselves well by themselves, or there are other processes outside what modern medicine thinks has to be delivered today, is really interesting in this particular case, because there's no doubt she was really ill, right?
Yes.
And yet she got better and she got really well. It's one of the few cases in a way in history that we can say that with some certainty. And we also know, as from what you're telling me, correct me if I'm wrong, that she never had any formal treatment as we would recognize it. So that's really fascinating as to what happened that got her well. What got her well?
Yeah.
Is a really interesting question.
So shall I take the 5 things that I think made her ill, and then how she recovered from each of them. Because I think
Okay.
the answer is all of what you say, actually.
Okay.
She had some components of treatment that we would give her today, but she got it for herself. And
Okay.
this is the bit that I really want to be talking about, because whenever I talk about this, somebody comes up to me afterwards and says, Anne, thank you so much. This helps my brother or my sister-in-law or whatever. So why did she go so bad when it had been so good? Answer one, insecure attachment. So, the theory that roughly, well, I'm not going to try and explain attachment to you, but that roughly 40% of the population don't form secure attachment bonds with their primary caregiver in a very early childhood. And therefore, they're never really able to internalize a sense of being safe. And in Victoria's case, why did she do this? This is the work of John Bowlby and particularly Colin Murray Parkes, who took Bowlby's work. Bowlby, great British psychologist of the last century, and who developed the concept of attachment theory with Ainsworth and so on. And Colin Murray Parkes took it and applied it to severe grief. And Parkes wrote that Victoria had insecure attachment, but he didn't explore it any further. I actually wrote to him. He's, I think, still alive. I wrote to him a few years ago in the nursing home where he is in North London and said, can we talk about this? But I sadly didn't get a reply. He may not be very well. Anyway, insecure attachment meant that she didn't have that safe, internalized safe space inside, which is why she clung to Albert inappropriately. And clung to prime ministers and clung to anybody that she tried, sort of desperately seeking. I mean, the television programs say that she was clinging to Lord Melbourne to seek a father. No. Too easy, too simple, not true. She was seeking any strong attachment figure. Now, as it happened, Albert was very good looking and clearly extremely good in bed. But he himself had insecure attachment. His childhood had been as distressed as hers, but of course his form of insecure attachment was avoidant, i.e., withdrawing from society, run away, not, so she's wanting more, he's thinking no, love and lust can get a couple a long way. So one is insecure attachment. Now, why did she have that? Bowlby and Parkes say from their research, I mean, there's now 60, 70, 80 years of research on this, say that the loss of a parent between the age of 6 and 12 months is statistically highly predictive of forming insecure attachment style later in life. I know I'm talking about attachment as if it's a trait and a thing, and it's not. It's contextually derived, but let's leave that to one side. Her father died when she was 8 months old. So straight away, you can see that she is likely to be insecurely attached. But it doesn't mean you're doomed if you lose a parent in that sensitive years. What matters is if the remaining parent can create a safe space for the child, or somebody, doesn't need to be a parent, somebody, the primary caregiver, can give the child security and safety. Her mother probably didn't. Her mother was scatty. But there were lots of nurses around who did. So it's hard to get to this. And then clearly, Sir John Conroy made things a lot worse. So one, insecure attachment. Two, people who have insecure attachment are vulnerable to a thing that was called complicated grief. It's now called prolonged grief. So complicated grief, capital C, capital G, it's a thing. 7 to 11% of the population gets it. We all of us sadly suffer great losses in life on the whole, parent, spouse, God forbid, a child. Almost all of us mercifully do recover, natural healing. But for 7 to 10, 11% of the population, they don't. And this new name that they're now calling it, prolonged grief, is better because it's very intense, as Victoria unquestionably had, and it's prolonged. Most of us, thank God, we get a little better after the first year and quite a bit better after 2 years. It's never the same, but we really can function. So people who have insecure attachment are vulnerable to complicated grief. People who have complicated grief are statistically more likely to have periods of social phobia. I'm absolutely sure Victoria had social phobia after it, because her reluctance to go out, she's highly conscientious, she'll do what prime ministers ask her, but she wouldn't open parliament, etc. It has all the hallmarks of social phobia. The person who's written about this most is her great biographer, Elizabeth Longford, who writes when one prime minister bullied her in 1867, I think, to go and to open parliament, how the people standing around her in parliament were shocked to see the state that she was in. She kept her dignity. People from more than 6 feet away wouldn't see it, but she was absolutely rigid and yet slightly shaking, and she had a few little tears in her eyes. She was clearly in a terrified state, which of course was further bullying. So those three things are derived from the context. The fourth thing, I think, is completely different. Why she went so downhill for those 10 years, and that's burnout. This is where I see so many parallels with my clients, and I'm sure you with yours. She's a highly conscientious woman. There's a huge workload. The empire is expanding all the time. The reach of government is expanding within the UK. It's just the Foreign Office when she started, and then the Home Office does more and more and more, and there's customs and the arts and etc. Not education until later in her life. And she wrote 6 million words in her lifetime. She was handling, when Albert was still alive, about 80 major dispatches a day, and it builds up. But the 1860s was the most difficult time in European history during her reign. The Franco-Prussian War, the Austro-Prussian War, etc. And so she's got this avalanche of work coming across her desk. She's grief-stricken. And the man who had managed it all, because the good thing that Albert did for her was he was essentially her private secretary. He was superb at managing the paper flow, at brief, and making sure she had the right briefing, the right notes. He would start work at 5 or 6 in the morning every morning. So by the time she got to her desk at 8 or 9, there'd be piles, tabulated, annotated, speaking notes, etc. And this is what our clients expect. This is what a chief executive must have with the avalanche of work coming across them. So Albert's taken away. She's got nothing. There were 2 doddery old chaps. One died in 1866 and the other was useless. And the cabinet, because of their increasing power, had never liked Albert, and they banned her having a private secretary. And she wasn't allowed a private secretary until 1867, when the doddery old chap was appointed. And her first true private secretary wasn't until 1869 with Ponsonby, Henry Ponsonby. Saved her life. And then the last thing, which I've already talked about, why she went so downhill, was identity. So she had this irreconcilable thing between being monarch and Victorian wife, and suddenly it's avalanched again, and now she's a widow, which she didn't expect. And Professor Catherine Shear at Columbia, the Institute for Prolonged Grief at Columbia University. So if anybody listening to this knows somebody who's experiencing prolonged grief, there is the answer. The treatment is available today. There are treatment paradigms. The Center for Complicated Grief at Columbia University, and there's a ton of absolutely first-class stuff, both for clinicians and for the public, on the website. You can download it. It's terrific. And you asked, did she have treatment?
Well, how did she get better?
How did she get better? If she had gone to the Center for Prolonged Grief in Columbia, one of the things that they would have advocated is a series of 16 counselling sessions, a structured intervention. She didn't have that. She had a taste of it. So Norman MacLeod, the Reverend Norman MacLeod, the moderator of the Church of Scotland, the Presbyterian Church, which she was also the chief of, was superb. I mean, I want to write an article about him one day. He was actually very like what a trained counsellor would be today. He had 3 sessions with her when she was in Scotland, and it made a noticeable difference. And then he got the call to go to India, and then he died. And so it didn't continue. But had she gone to Columbia, they would also have encouraged her to do journaling. So she wrote her way out of it. But what they also would have said was vital was what they call companionship. So Victoria had never had a friend, remember, as a child. And she didn't as an adult, because Albert took her away from the court as part of his own control. And John Brown. So if you've heard of Victoria, you've probably heard of John Brown, who was her Highland servant, very menial initially, and became very important. He was with her 18 years, and he became a primary relationship for her. And they used to say that insecure attachment, you're stuck with it for life. And we now know that, of course, you're not. That if you can form a secure, strong relationship with somebody who is securely attached, then you can rebuild. And of course, Catherine Shear points out the neuroscience of this is that we've got so many neural connections in the brain that we've got to reform after a great shock, that we're exhausted and so on. And we need support. And she had it in John Brown. Were they sleeping together? Almost certainly not. Was he her first true friend? Definitely. And I think it made a difference. He was a solid rock. He was utterly loyal. All the courtiers hated him with good reason. She didn't care. He drank, he swore, he died of cirrhosis of the liver. She didn't care. He was implacably loyal to her, and he was utterly solid. And that helped. So the journaling helped, the solid relationship helped, and the social phobia, I think she got over on her own by doing good, plain behaviorism. As you know, behaviorism is a good answer to phobias, which is, graded exposure therapy. It didn't work. It made her worse if somebody dragged her to Parliament against her will. But in the late 1860s, when she got a little bit of courage and she could manage her own exposure with the public, she went to Wolverhampton to unveil a statue to Albert. She controlled it. She was in charge. She can control her exposure. She did not find it an aversive experience. She found it actually quite enjoyable. So she did more and more and more. She was her own therapist.
Tell us a bit more about John Brown, though. I mean, he was a courtier. Who was he, and how did he suddenly come to prominence?
He was a Scots gillie. So he was responsible for mucking out the ponies and escorting them on trips up the mountain and standing around in a kilt, looking very, very attractive. He had magnificent legs, and Victoria liked beauty. All the men in her life were beautiful.
Okay, but she hung out with him when she was in Scotland, or she hung out with him down south.
Albert, when her mother died, which of course was the same year as Albert, so that's another reason why she was flung into this deep grief. When her mother died, and she lost it in March of the same year, Albert thought that it would be helpful for her to get some fresh air, and encouraged John Brown, who had been his gillie, to become her gillie, to take her on pony rides and so on, and get fresh air. So the most perfect authority on this is not some academic treatise. It's the movie Mrs. Brown with Judi Dench and Billy Connolly. A lot of the other stuff I'd rather not comment on because, but that movie is historically super accurate and captures it. Anyway,
captures the relationship.
Captures
the relationship between Victoria.
Captures the relationship.
And John
And then
Brown.
After Albert died, her daughter Alice thought, her mother was in such a terrible state. Alice thought, she needs fresh air. She liked that gillie in Scotland. They brought her down to the Isle of Wight, brought Brown down to the Isle of Wight. And he began taking her for pony rides and so on. And she began to trust him. She had a very good sense of judgment of people. She could tell she could trust him. So she trusted him more and more. He ended up carrying state documents between one party and another, which made the courtiers hate him even more. But he was by her side until he died. He became like her principal servant.
Well, this has been fascinating talking to you, but we're running out of time a little bit. I just want to ask you something else. What was her own understanding of what was happening to her? We would call it various modern names like clinical depression, or you use complicated grief. Now, there is a psychological power to labeling something in the way that you did, right? Because it begins to shape the way we think about it. And in the modern world, if you label it complicated grief or clinical depression, there's a natural logical implication, which is you need professional treatment. Okay, there's an action plan that is suggested by the terminology. That's the power of the terminology. And sometimes the terminology, in my view, is not helpful because it doesn't suggest an action plan. Yet people seem to want to be labeled in this modern world for various reasons, and often they don't quite see that it may not actually be helpful, right? So the language is very important.
It reifies
what did
something.
Yes, exactly, which may not be quite as real as people think it is. Diabetes is real because there's a blood test and stuff, but everything else after that, in terms of clinical depression, anxiety, people love these terms as if they're referring to diabetes, and they don't quite understand that they're not necessarily. And that's a bit scary. But anyway, in a way, people need a way of thinking about something. Sometimes diagnosis is a useful way of thinking. If you turn up to casualty with sudden crushing chest pain, the fact you may be having a myocardial infarction is a very useful label, right? But it's a useful label because it leads to an action plan that can save your life. Now, what was her way of thinking about what was going on? Because you wouldn't have used words like complicated grief. It didn't exist back in the day. So, and we're running out of time, so I'm loading up all the questions very quickly. The other thing that I find really fascinating, because I think your story, which has been well told by you, tells us something really interesting about the nature of psychiatric disorder, which pertains to this day, which is she was the top of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and yet she could be ill for 10 years without treatment. Whereas if she'd had other disorders, a whole set of other doctors would have turned up. So it's interesting how psychiatric disorder can elude treatment, even at the center of a huge amount of resources. Anyway, back to you.
How did she perceive it? She had something which I call meta-analysis, a meta-perception. So she could see her own situation. She saw what Albert was doing to her. She loved him, but she saw that he was shaping it his way. She was amazing. The reason I like the term complicated grief is exactly what you say. It may make a thing which is not a thing. However, it points people to where they can get help. I think had she got better help, had she seen Catherine Shear, her suffering might have been shorter. But she's an amazing case study because she did it on her own. She got there. She flourished. And she had the scales were so against her, and she still flourished.
And again, what is fascinating about your story is she becomes an inspiring figure in a way I never would have thought of her as inspiring, not because she was the head of the greatest empire the world has ever seen, but because of this personal battle, the overcoming of the personal demons, I think. That's what's so interesting.
And her personal character. She, like Queen Elizabeth, knew that the adulation was for the role and not for the person. She was personally humble.
Do you think there are any other lessons in the minute and 40 seconds we've got left that we might draw from her story?
Yes. My female, very senior leadership clients have even today, put up with not having the right support. Victoria suffered because of not having proper private secretaries. And it made a big difference when Henry Ponsonby arrived. And too many women still put up with not having the right support that the comparable men in comparable roles would demand.
Anything else?
She was able to have fun, leaving aside the 1860s. You know, she had a huge job and she was still able to find satisfaction and fun in it. I think a lot of people, she worked exceedingly hard, but she had fun. But she also had huge physical stamina. People need that for the job.
So in the 30 seconds we've got left, male chief executives will think nothing of going out for a round of golf as a way of doing business, right? But they're still having fun, okay? So men may take their jobs seriously. Many men don't have fun. They take their jobs too seriously, in my opinion.
Yes.
quite often. But do women in particular have a problem with the notion of having fun? Women, the theory goes, you're going to slap me down for this gender difference point, I'm sure. Women tend to have a more strong sense of responsibility. There could be evolutionary psychology reasons for that, but they tend to be way more responsible when they're in a role in terms of taking responsibility for doing the job well, more so, in my opinion, than many men. And does that sense of responsibility overburden them so they don't think of fun as being a very important part of what survival is about?
Possibly in the past, but there are some extraordinary examples now among Mailer Campbell graduates. I was just reading the graduation essays this week, and there's some young women who are having a blast, who are running the world, having a blast.
We've got to think about closing. We're over time. Anne Scoular, thank you very much indeed. A lot of the material you've been talking about, her diaries and letters, I think are available freely online. Is that right?
Correct. Yep.
And so they can look for that. And can they, if
they
want to read more about your
Victoria
work?
Diaries.
But if they want to read more about your work, can you tell us a bit about what they could do? They could go and look at the website for the coaching organization. What else could they do if they want to follow?
Look on the Mailer Campbell website. I've got a longer version of this lecture, which is on the Mailer Campbell website. That's Meyler Campbell, Campbell. It's all there.
Great. Anne Scoular, expert on Queen Victoria and also an expert in training executive coaches. Thank you very much indeed.